creativity was dying when I was using drugs.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who, now that I think about it, are probably the single most successful alternative rock band of all time. And their roots go way back to the early LA punk rock scene, where they came up seeing bands like Black Flag, X, and the Germs. And then when they started their band, they took that attitude, injected a little bit of George Clinton-inspired funk, and created something totally fresh and new. And they had no real intention or ambition of being anything more than just another LA punk band. But 40 years later, here they are. Over 120 million albums sold, 6 Grammys won, countless other awards, and still hitting the very top of the Billboard charts. And what I think is really interesting is that despite all of that, they get essentially zero attention or respect from the critics. And personally, I will admit that I'm not the biggest fan of their newer material, but the honest truth is that they're kind of the uncrowned kings of alternative rock, and by far some of the very best musicians of this whole generation. And so the question is, how did they do it? How did they go from a struggling punk band to one of the biggest bands in the history of rock? And what is their lasting impact and influence? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there's a link to that in the description of this video. The Red Hot Chili Peppers started out way back in 1982 when the original core lineup of Anthony Kiedis, Flea, and Hilo Slovak met at Fairfax High School. And the three of them quickly became best friends, basically living like wild animals, just partying, doing drugs, going to clubs that they were way too young to get into, and going to see punk bands at the time like Devo, Blondie, and the Germs. And after hearing a band called Defunct, they were inspired to start their own band that combined punk rock with funk, and for their name, they chose Tony Flo and the Miraculous Masters of Mayhem. Probably a good thing they didn't keep that one. Somewhere along the way, they changed it to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. The exact origin of who came up with the name seems to be something they argue about, but either way, they started playing local shows around LA and quickly started to get noticed in the scene, as well as local media outlets like LA Weekly. They also got a fair amount of attention from the punk scene, since Flea was also playing bass in Fear, who were really in the spotlight at the time after their notorious performance on Saturday Night Live, where they brought 50 punks along with them who basically trashed the set. And speaking of Fear, within a year or so of forming, they recorded their first demo with Spit Stacks, the drummer of Fear, featuring a lot of songs that would end up being on their first album, like Out in LA, which was kind of like an autobiography about the wild life that they were living around the Los Angeles area.
Oh, LA's the place that's my mind blaze. For me at the race, you're a cotton picking maze. For you at the chase, but I lose you in the haze. And now you spend your days catching waves and you check to go out.
And listening to that now, what I find really amazing is that, number one, they were all like 19 or 20 years old at the time, but also that Flea had only learned bass like 2 years before recording this. He had played trumpet before that, and even then, he was better than most bassists to this day. And they gave out these demos around LA without any real goal besides just playing slightly bigger shows, but their party vibe and stage presence just couldn't be denied. There was one early show in particular that really changed everything for them, where they brought out their signature move of playing wearing nothing but socks, and the right people noticed. As Anthony Kiedis put it, "When we walked back on stage wearing only the socks, the crowd audibly gasped. We weren't deterred for one moment by the collective state of shock that the audience was experiencing." And one of the people in their crowd that day was their first manager, who took them on as a client and really helped them to graduate from that status of just a local band playing parties. Their momentum kept building. They got to play some bigger shows, like opening for Danny Elfman's band Oingo Boingo. And in late 1983, they signed to EMI Records, home of the Sex Pistols. They were thrilled to finally get into a real studio with a real budget, and they got Andy Gill of the British post-punk band Gang of Four to produce their debut album, which came out in 1984. As excited as they were to work with him, unfortunately they butted heads with him a lot, quite a bit in the studio, and to be honest, it kind of shows on the album. As Anthony Kiedis said years later, all those songs sounded like they had gone through a sterilizing goody two-shoes machine. When we used to play them, they were so vicious sounding, and now they sounded like bubblegum pop. The album got mixed reviews and it didn't sell well, but they did get another chance to go into the studio, this time with the legendary funk musician George Clinton as producer, to record their second album, Freaky Styley. Personally, I think this album is definitely a step forward, but still, honestly, it's not great. With that said, their momentum was clearly building. For example, they got a cameo in the iconic 1980s skate movie Thrashin'.
Fabulous Red Hot Chili Peppers, the band that gets your pulses pounding, your senses reeling, and sets your mouth on fire.
Which brings us to what is, in my opinion, the first album to really capture the greatness of the early Red Hot Chili Peppers, which is the Uplift Mofo Party Plan from 1987. It was really funky with a ton of groove and that upbeat late 80s kind of energy that when I listen to it, it just makes me feel like one of the kids in those Bugle Boy ads from when I was in 5th grade. It's just a really fun album, and honestly, it might be my favorite thing they've ever done, even though objectively they do have better albums.
I'm here today to talk about the Uplift Mofo Party Plan, a plan based on a band.
But for all the fun, good time, party vibes of the album, what fans couldn't see is that the band had a huge problem that was tearing them apart, namely heroin. And drugs were not a new thing for them because pretty much the whole band had been using drugs in one form or another since the very beginning. Some coke before a show, some downers to get to sleep afterwards, maybe a few drinks, but there were 2 members of the band that went a little bit harder than everyone else.
My creativity was dying when I was using drugs.
First of all, Anthony Kiedis' heroin use had become a huge problem for the band, to the point where he would show up to practice or recording sessions literally asleep. And eventually Flea confronted him saying, "Anthony, we're kicking you out of the band. We want to play music and you obviously don't, so you have to go. We're going to go get a different singer and go on, so you're out of here." Getting kicked out of the band that he started was enough of a wake-up call that he did go to rehab and the band took him back. Although he did fall back into his addiction within a couple months, he was at least semi-functional, to the point where the band was able to carry on. As he put it, "I was still carrying around that 1 foot on a banana peel, 1 foot in the grave energy, but I was trying to be respectful of this new place in my life." Their guitarist Hillel Slovak was unfortunately not able to keep it together. And on June 25th, 1988, he died of a heroin overdose. And understandably, this almost tore the band apart.
Devastated beyond, almost impossible to actually fully digest a loss of that size. I don't think any of us ever really thought that that would happen.
Hillel was their best friend, a core part of the music. People around the band blamed Anthony for his death, and their drummer Jack Irons quit the band saying, "This is not where I want to be. I do not want to be part of something where my fucking friends are dying." And as tragic as that moment was, Flea and Anthony ultimately decided to keep the band going. After trying out a few replacements, including D.H. Peligro from Dead Kennedys on drums, they ultimately landed on what most people would consider their classic lineup, with Chad Smith on drums and John Frusciate on guitar. And they quickly started working on what would be their first real breakthrough album, Mother's Milk, which came out in 1989 and featured 2 breakout songs. The first was kind of a funk metal cover of Higher Ground by Stevie Wonder, and the other was an original song reflecting on the band's struggle with addiction called Knock Me Down. And despite being only 18 years old at the time, their new guitarist, John Frusciate, was a musical genius, and it was obvious how much he added to the band. And with all due respect to Hillel Slovak and Jack Irons, this album was just on another level than anything else they had done. So it's interesting that after recording it, the band didn't necessarily love it. As Anthony put it, "We didn't finish that record and say, this is our best album ever." With that being said, Mother's Milk was a success. It quickly went gold. They got the kind of radio and MTV airplay that had eluded them before, and it seemed like the band was on the verge of something big. Which brings us to their 5th album, Blood Sugar Sex Magik, in 1991, which changed everything for the band. They had just signed to Warner Brothers after a bidding war. They got the legendary Rick Rubin to produce their album. Their new lineup was fully gelled with John on guitar. The band was just firing on all cylinders, and it showed. It felt like for the past few years, they'd been sort of teetering on the edge of a mainstream breakthrough, and that finally came with the second single from Blood Sugar Sex Magik, Under the Bridge, which was once again about drugs, specifically about Anthony Kiedis shooting up under a bridge in downtown LA.
I don't ever wanna feel like I did
And on the back of that song, the album hit number 2 on Billboard. The Red Hot Chili Peppers went on tour with Nirvana and Pearl Jam. When those bands were the hottest thing on the planet, they had officially arrived as a mainstream success. And personally, I consider this album to be just an absolute masterpiece. And that 3-album streak of the Uplift Mofo Party Plan, Mother's Milk, and Blood Sugar Sex Magic is just incredible. Like, all 3 of those albums are 10s in my book. And it's also worth noticing that they sounded just completely different from almost every other alternative band at the time. As one review put it, they were one of the very few genre-bending bands that were able to make a radical impact on the sonic landscape that was dominated, it seemed, from every minute angle by grunge. But with all of that success, unfortunately, drug addiction reared its head again for the band. John Frusciate had secretly started using heroin to cope with the pressures of fame, saying to Anthony, "We're too popular. I don't need to be at this level of success. I would just be proud to be playing this music in clubs like you guys were doing 2 years ago." Fans didn't know about that part, but something was clearly off, culminating in their bizarre appearance on Saturday Night Live, where John seemed to deliberately play Under the Bridge in the wrong key.
Nobody out there, hard to believe that I'm all alone.
And that may sound like some crazy conspiracy theory, but remember, we're talking about John Frusciate here. He is a legit musical genius that does not make those kind of mistakes. And all of that eventually culminated in him suddenly leaving the band while they were on tour in Japan. They replaced him with former Jane's Addiction guitarist Dave Navarro, while John spiraled into depression, living in honestly really sad, disgusting conditions in his house, just like piled high with garbage and drug paraphernalia, as his addiction got worse and worse, which brought the band to what I think of as really their second era, starting with One Hot Minute in 1995, which was quite a bit darker and less funky than Blood Sugar Sex Magic. One Hot Minute was generally seen as kind of a disappointing follow-up, and as big of a fan as I was of Blood Sugar Sex Magic, I personally didn't like this album at all. And to this day, it seems to be one of the fans' overall least favorite albums. And their relationship with Dave Navarro was also falling apart for various other reasons. As he put it, "One was my drug use at the time. The other was musical differences. Anthony says it was because I tripped and fell over an amp while on drugs. I say that he was on more drugs than me at that point. We both had a loose relationship with reality. Who do you want to believe?" With their last album being a disappointment and their lineup once again in shambles due to drugs, it seemed like the band was maybe ready to call it a day. Another promising band torn apart by addiction. But if addiction is the common thread underlying all of the Chili Peppers' problems, overcoming addiction was their salvation. Some of their friends convinced John Frusciate to go to rehab, and in 1998, he rejoined the Red Hot Chili Peppers, restoring what most people would consider to be the band's best lineup, and setting the stage for their comeback album Californication in 1999, featuring the lead single Scar Tissue.
Wave goodbye to Maui and Paul, 'cause with the birds of shade.
And I almost look at this album as Blood Sugar Sex Magic Part 2. With the same lineup, Rick Rubin once again back as producer, and a similar sound, just a little bit darker and more melodic. And nobody really knew if the Red Hot Chili Peppers could come back and reclaim their former spot, but that is exactly what they did. The album hit number 3 on Billboard and has sold over 11 million copies worldwide. To this date, their most commercially successful album, and consistently in the top 3 of their fans' favorite albums. And so if anybody doubted them, this album proved that the Red Hot Chili Peppers were officially back. Rounding out the decade with an appearance at the very ill-fated Woodstock 99 festival, which was sadly defined by the riots and the fires as much as it was the music. They followed up Californication with By the Way in 2002, which is probably my personal least favorite album of theirs. It's not that it's bad, it just, in my opinion, doesn't really sound like the Chili Peppers, which is because unlike their previous albums, which tended to be more of a collaboration from jam sessions, this album was written almost entirely by John Frusciate, who drew a lot of inspiration from English post-punk bands like The Smiths, Gang of Four, and Susie Sue, and you can really hear that in songs like Universally Speaking, that sound less like Red Hot Chili Peppers funk songs and almost more like The Strokes. And this once again made tensions flare up within the band, with Flea wanting to play more of their classic funk sound and John pushing in the other direction. But they were able to put all of that aside, and after a massive 2-year-long world tour from 2002 to 2004, they came back with Stadium Arcadium in 2006, which was another return to form for them. The funk was back. It was also their first album to hit #1 on Billboard, which is pretty incredible for a band that was 20 years deep into their career at this point, especially considering all the ups and downs that they had already had. But unfortunately, as seems to always be the case with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, that stability was short-lived. After an extended break where a lot of the members pursued various side projects, John Frusciate once again left the band in 2008, which brings me to what I would consider the lowest period of the band, the era where Josh Klinghoffer replaced John Frusciate on guitar, I'm With You in 2011, and The Gateway in 2016. And these albums both hit #2 on Billboard, so they were successful in that regard. But when I listen to it, I don't know, they just don't really stand out in any way. There's nothing wrong with them, but there's really nothing right with them either. And most fans seem to agree that these albums are just kind of middle of the road. Which brings us to more or less the present day. Yet another rise, fall, and rise again for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. After 3 albums without John Frusciate, in 2019, the Chili Peppers announced that he was rejoining the band once again for the 3rd time and that Josh Klinghoffer was leaving.
It seemed like I had changed and grown enough as a person to where it felt like it would be a beautiful thing to have another chance to do it right. I was seeing Anthony and Flea and Chad through a different lens than I had seen them through when I quit.
And just for the record, Josh says it was completely amicable, and in his words, it's absolutely John's place to be in that band. So that's why I'm happy for him. I'm happy that he's back with them. And to be completely honest, he's right. The Chili Peppers just weren't the Chili Peppers without John, and that became obvious when they released their album Unlimited Love in 2022, which was very clearly the best thing they had done since Stadium Arcadium, and it really felt like another return to form. And fans seem to agree with that, with the album debuting at #1 on Billboard. And this was followed closely by another album, The Return of the Dream Canteen, which was a collection of songs recorded at the same time as Unlimited Love. They initially wanted to release this as something like a 7-disc set, which the label shot down, and they compromised on doing it this way as 2 separate albums. And to me, Return of the Dream Canteen kind of feels like a collection of B-sides, although for the record, the band insists that that is not the case. And Black Summer, the lead single from Unlimited Love, was their 14th song to hit #1 on the alternative charts, which is unmatched by any other artist. And amazingly, 40 years into their career, it seems like they are as relevant as ever. Which brings us to the last question: what is their lasting impact and influence? And to me, this is a little bit of a weird one, because for such a massively successful band, you don't really hear any artists mentioning them as a direct influence in the same way as you do with other huge alternative bands like Green Day, Linkin Park, or 9 Inch Nails. So I'm sure that the Chili Peppers were a gateway band for millions and millions of kids to get into music, but I can't say that I really hear a lot of their influence on music these days. And at the same time, I also think that they're kind of underrated in the sense that, objectively speaking, they are clearly the undisputed kings of alternative rock, because there is really just nobody bigger than them, and I don't really think they get credit for that. And I think we also have to talk about the simple fact that they are some of the absolute best musicians in all of rock. Anthony isn't the most talented vocalist in the world, as I'm sure he would admit, but when it comes to Flea, John, and Chad, all 3 of them are just insanely talented and have that kind of musical chemistry that just cannot be denied. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos and podcasts early. I do giveaways. There are members only channels in my Discord, and there is also a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.